A 6-year-old girl counted every coin in her little tin box, walked up to the quietest man she'd ever seen, and placed a plate of spaghetti in front of him. She didn't know his name, didn't know why everyone in the restaurant avoided his table, and she certainly didn't know that the man sitting alone outside the diner where her mother worked was the head of one of the most dangerous crime families in New York. He hadn't eaten, hadn't ordered, hadn't spoken to a single soul in over 3 hours, not because he couldn't afford to, but because today was the one day each year he allowed himself to remember his mother. And the marinara that this child had just set before him was the exact dish his mother used to make in that very same kitchen when she was just another broke immigrant with nothing but her hands and a dream. He could have ignored the girl, could have waved her off the way he'd dismissed men who'd begged for 5 minutes of his time. But he didn't, because something about the way she looked at him, without fear, without judgment, cracked open a door inside him he'd spent decades welding shut. But what happened next? What the girl's mother would discover about this stranger, and what he would do when he noticed the bruises she tried so hard to hide. That's where this story truly begins. If this story touches your heart, leave a like so more people can find it. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Now, let's go back to that warm October afternoon in Brooklyn, to a small restaurant called Russo's Kitchen, where everything was about to change. Russo's Kitchen sat on the corner of a quiet street in a residential pocket of southern Brooklyn, the kind of restaurant you might walk right past without ever noticing if you weren't local. The storefront was narrow, with a red and white striped fabric awning faded by years of sun. A glass door with a small handwritten open sign hanging slightly crooked to one side, and inside was that familiar warmth only family restaurants seem to carry after they've been around long enough for the scent of garlic and oregano to seep into every brick in the wall. Connie Russo had bought the place from the previous owner about 15 years earlier, when she'd just lost her husband and needed something to keep herself from falling apart. She'd kept almost everything exactly the same, from the scratched wooden chairs to the chalk menu written on the blackboard behind the counter, because she believed a good restaurant didn't need to change, it only needed to go on being itself. That Saturday afternoon, the place was busy enough to keep a steady rhythm without tipping into chaos. A few families were eating a late meal. An older couple near the window shared a plate of tiramisu. There was the clink of silverware against plates, soft laughter, and quiet Italian music drifting from an old speaker mounted near the ceiling. Amelia Ward moved between the tables with a tray in her hands, her steps quick and precise in the way of someone who'd done the job long enough for her body to know the path without her mind having to give the order. She smiled at customers with the kind of polite smile anyone who'd waited tables long enough learns to master, warm enough to make people feel welcome, but never reaching her eyes. Her eyes were tired, not the tiredness of a long shift, but the kind that had been there for a very long time, the kind sleep couldn't fix because it didn't come from the body. Her hair was tied back in a hurry with a black elastic band, a few loose strands sticking to her forehead from the heat of the kitchen, and every time she passed the corner table near the inner window, she glanced down in the quick, automatic way of a reflex. Sophie sat there on a chair just a little too tall for her, a faded pale pink backpack resting at her feet, with a pad of drawing paper and a box of crayons in front of her. The little girl drew with deep concentration, her head tilted slightly, the tip of her tongue peeking out in that habit children have when they're trying to color inside the lines, and every now and then, she'd look up to watch her mother pass, then lower her head and continue, as if simply confirming that her mother was still there was enough. Connie stood behind the register drying glasses. She was the kind of woman you only had to look at once to know she'd lived through enough not to be surprised by much of anything anymore, with a round face, salt and pepper hair pinned into a neat bun, and hands that never seemed to stop working even when her mouth was busy talking. She glanced out through the glass door toward the table on the patio where the man sat without moving, then turned back, lowering her voice just enough for Amelia to hear as she passed the counter. "He comes once a year," Connie said, not taking her eyes off the glass she was drying. "Always sits in that same spot. Never orders anything. Don't ask. Don't go near him." Amelia glanced outside, only long enough to catch the shape of the man, sitting alone in the slanting afternoon light, then returned to her work without another word, because she already had enough in her head to worry about without adding the mystery of a stranger. But at the table inside, two of the other waitresses didn't have the same restraint. They whispered to each other, stole glances outside, then quickly looked away whenever they thought someone might have noticed. No one knew him personally, but the older staff whispered the name Dante in hushed, fearful tones when they thought no one was listening, a name that Sophie, with the sharp ears of a child, quietly tucked away in her memory. All anyone knew was that every year, on this exact date, he appeared, sat there until dark, then disappeared as if he'd never come at all. And outside, on the old iron chair beneath the faded awning of Russo's kitchen, the man still sat there, motionless, staring into the empty space ahead of him, as if the rest of the world didn't exist. If you'd asked anyone in the restaurant that day about the man sitting out on the patio, they would have described him in almost exactly the same way. A man in a black suit, not the kind you buy at a mall, but the kind you look at once and know immediately it costs money. Even without a logo, without any flashy detail, the fabric soft, the tailoring exact against his body, the kind of expensive only people with real money wear, because they don't need anyone to know. The collar of his white shirt was open at one button. No tie, no watch showing, no ring, nothing unnecessary. His black hair was combed neatly back, his hairline sharp, his face angular with the jaw clenched as if he were holding something in behind the skin. And his eyes were the thing that made people look away the fastest, not because they were angry or threatening, but because they weren't looking at anyone, weren't looking at anything, as if he were seeing straight through whatever stood in front of him into some place only he could see. His body stayed motionless on the iron chair in a way no one could sustain for that long unless they were used to waiting, or used to controlling every muscle in their body so completely that even their breathing was almost invisible. A mother walking past on the sidewalk with her child instinctively pulled the little one to the other side without even realizing she'd done it. A man out with his dog stopped to tie his shoe as an excuse to look, then walked faster than usual afterward. Human instinct is like that. When something dangerous is nearby, the body knows before the mind has time to understand. But Dante Corsetti wasn't sitting here to frighten anyone. He sat here because this was the only place in the world where he allowed himself not to be Dante Corsetti. Not the name that made people stop breathing when they heard it spoken in closed rooms. Not the shadow behind dozens of deals the press never knew about, and the police never managed to prove. Here, on this chair, in front of the small restaurant the world had forgotten, he was only Rosa's son. He didn't think of his mother in clear images. Not her face, not her voice, not any memory with a sharp outline, because he'd learned that if he let memory take shape, it would become too real, and anything too real had the power to break him. Instead, he felt her through smaller things. The scent of oregano drifting out from Russo's kitchen through the crack of the door whenever someone opened the back entrance. That smell slipping into the late afternoon air and striking his chest in a way he could never prepare for. Every time like the first time, every time making his jaw tighten and his chest draw in with that familiar ache that over 2 decades still hadn't managed to dull. He inhaled slowly, held it, then exhaled, controlled, calm, the way he controlled everything else in his life. But here, that control was thinner than he wanted to admit. A block to the east, a black SUV sat, parked at the curb beneath a maple tree, whose leaves were beginning to turn, the engine off but the electrical system still running. Frank Lombardi sat in the driver's seat, the window lowered just enough for cigarette smoke to drift out, his eyes never leaving the small monitor mounted on the dashboard, where the camera feed showed the restaurant patio and the man sitting there. Frank's right hand rested on his thigh, less than 2 seconds from the gun in the holster beneath his jacket if he needed it. After 20 years with Dante, Frank knew every ritual his boss had, knew which days were more dangerous than others, knew when to stay close and when to keep his distance. Today belonged to the second kind. Every year on this date, Dante came to that small restaurant, sat alone, said nothing, ate nothing, gave no orders, and Frank understood that this wasn't the time to ask questions or to come near. This was the time when the boss didn't want to be the boss. Frank's job was simple: make sure no one disturbed Dante, and if anyone dared to, make sure they never got the chance to do it a second time. Up until this moment, there'd never been a year when anyone was reckless enough to sit down at that table. Until today. The plate of spaghetti marinara sat in front of Dante, steam rising from it in a thin ribbon that curled through the late afternoon light, and he looked at it the way a man looks at something that shouldn't exist there, shouldn't exist in front of him, shouldn't exist on this day. His hand tightened beneath the table, his fingers pressing into each other until his knuckles turned pale. But outwardly, his face didn't change. It was still that face, still that composure 20 years at the head of an underground empire had taught him to keep in every situation. But this plate of pasta wasn't a situation. It was a memory with a shape, Sophie sat across from him on an iron chair too tall for her, her feet swinging a distance above the ground, both hands resting obediently on the table, her wide eyes fixed on him with that patient expectation only children possess, the kind of patience that doesn't know how to hurry, because children haven't yet learned that time is something limited. She didn't say anything. She only watched him, as if whether he ate or didn't eat was the most important decision in the world at this moment, and she was prepared to sit there until he made it. Dante looked at the little girl, then he looked back at the plate of pasta. Spaghetti marinara. The strands were coated evenly in a deep red tomato sauce, a few fresh basil leaves scattered over the top, the scent of lightly fried garlic mingling with oregano as it rose with the steam, and it was that smell, not the sight of it, not anything he saw with his eyes, but that smell that struck him first. It didn't smell like anything from any restaurant he'd stepped into over the last 20 years. It didn't smell like the expensive dinners in dining rooms run by Michelin-starred chefs. It didn't smell like any Italian pasta dish he'd ever been served. It smelled like his mother's hands, so much like them that his chest gave a sudden sharp ache, as if someone had just pressed a hand against the exact wound he'd believed had already healed. He picked up the fork slowly and twisted a few strands of pasta around it, then lifted them to his mouth. The first bite, the taste of tomatoes simmered for a long time, naturally sweet not from sugar but from time. The garlic not too strong, the oregano lingering softly at the end, and all of it came together into a flavor he knew down to the smallest detail, because this flavor had once been the taste of every evening in the small kitchen when he was still a boy sitting on a high chair waiting for his mother to set a plate in front of him. He chewed, slowly, swallowed, then picked up the fork again. The second bite was easier than the first. The third was easier than the second. Not because his taste buds were adjusting, but because something inside him, something that had been locked tight for 23 years, was beginning to loosen little by little each time the fork touched the plate. Sophie watched him eat with open satisfaction on her face, that pure kind of satisfaction only a 6-year-old can have when a small action of hers brings a result. And then she began to talk, not because she thought he wanted to hear, but because at that age, too much silence with another person feels unnatural. She told him about school, about a teacher named Miss Patterson who liked to have the class draw pictures on Fridays, and Sophie always finished first but never raised her hand to show anyone because she liked keeping her drawings to herself. She told him about the stray yellow cat that liked to lie on the back steps of the restaurant. She'd named it Cheese because it was yellow like cheese, and whenever her mother gave her a leftover piece of bread, she always hid half of it in her pocket so she could bring it out to Cheese after school. She told him about the picture she was still working on inside, a house with large windows and a sky full of clouds shaped like animals. She'd tried to draw one cloud like an elephant, but it came out looking like a dog, so she decided it was a flying dog. Dante didn't say a word the whole time Sophie talked. He didn't nod politely. He didn't ask empty questions just to seem engaged. He didn't offer any of the reactions adults usually perform when they're listening to children talk but aren't really listening at all. He listened. He truly listened. He listened in a way he hadn't listened to anyone in years, because in his world no one spoke without a purpose. No one opened their mouth without wanting something. Every conversation was either a negotiation, or a plea, or a lie. But this little girl wanted nothing from him. She was simply talking because she had something to say, and he was the person sitting across from her. That was all. And that simplicity, in a life where nothing had ever been simple, made him not want to rise from this chair. Sophie stopped in the middle of her story about Cheese the cat, and tilted her head to one side in the way children often do when they're studying something adults don't realize they're being watched for. Then she asked, her voice soft and direct as if it were the most ordinary question in the world, "Why are you sad?" Dante's fork stopped in midair, not because the question was rude, or because the little girl had crossed one of those boundaries adults like to draw between strangers, but because in the last 20 years, not one person, not a subordinate, not an enemy, not a lawyer, not a single living creature had looked at his face and used that word. Sad. People looked at him and saw power, saw danger, saw control so perfect it was almost inhuman, but no one looked at him and saw sadness, because to see that, you had to look past every layer that came first, and no one stayed close to him long enough, or dared enough, to do that. No one except this 6-year-old little girl, who didn't know there were layers to look past, so she looked straight at the thing buried deepest inside him, without having any idea she'd just done what the whole world hadn't been able to do. He set the fork down slowly. "What makes you think I'm sad?" he asked, his voice calm, but a little lower than before, low enough that if Frank had heard it through the surveillance device, he would have known that wasn't the boss's voice, but the voice of a man who'd just been caught hiding something. Sophie didn't hesitate. "Because you look like my mom when she thinks I'm not watching." She said it without knowing how heavy those words were, without knowing that the sentence didn't just touch Dante. It drove straight through him, through the black suit, through 20 years of building an empire, through every wall he'd raised to make sure no one could ever hurt him again, and landed precisely in the place he'd sealed shut on the day he stood beside his mother's hospital bed and watched her close her eyes for the last time. Not because the sentence was profound, but because it was true. True in the way only children know how to be true, without calculation, without hidden meaning, just pure observation, spoken in pure language. He looked at the little girl, and the world around him blurred for a moment. The sound of traffic on the street disappeared. The late Brooklyn sunlight disappeared. The iron chair beneath him disappeared. And he was no longer sitting outside Russo's kitchen. He was standing in the kitchen behind this restaurant, except it was the kitchen from more than 30 years ago. Smaller, older, with yellow brick walls stained with grease, a ceiling fan turning slowly without doing enough to push away the heat, and in the center of that kitchen was Rosa. His mother stood at the stove, her white apron turned ivory with age and smeared with blotches of tomato sauce, her hands rough from washing dishes and scrubbing pots, her black hair twisted up with a cheap clip, a fine sheen of sweat across her forehead, but she was smiling. She always smiled when she cooked. That was the thing he remembered most clearly about his mother. Not her face when she was tired, not her eyes when she worried about the rent or immigration papers, but her smile when she set a plate of pasta in front of him, Dante at 6 years old, sitting on a wooden chair raised higher with an old phone book so his legs could reach the tabletop. And she said, her voice gentle with the Italian cadence she'd never lost, no matter how many years she'd lived in America, "Food made with love always tastes different." The boy Dante had believed that. Believed it completely, without doubt, without question. Believed it in the way only a 6-year-old child knows how to believe. Because if his mother said it, then it had to be true. And now, 30 years later, the man Dante looked at the plate of spaghetti marinara that a strange little girl had bought for him with the coins from her tin box, and he knew his mother had been right, because this plate of pasta did taste different. Not because of the recipe, not because of the cook's skill, but because a child who didn't know him at all had emptied out her few precious coins to buy it for the man she thought was hungry. The memory faded. He returned to the present and looked at Sophie sitting in front of him, her legs still swinging, her eyes still round, and he saw something that made his chest tighten again, but in a different way, not pain, but recognition. He saw himself at that age, a child sitting in the restaurant kitchen waiting for his mother, not knowing the world outside would take her away, would take his innocence away, would turn him into something his 6-year-old self wouldn't even recognize. Sophie was the same. She sat here innocent, not knowing that her mother carried bruises beneath her sleeves, not knowing the world had already begun taking things from her that she wasn't old enough yet to protect. He inhaled slowly, then asked, his voice even, but soft enough not to sound like a question from the man this whole city feared. "Where's your mom?" Sophie turned in her chair and lifted one small finger, pointing straight through the glass door into the restaurant, where Amelia was carrying a tray past the register. And for the first time, since he'd sat down in this chair 3 hours earlier, Dante Corsetti looked inside Russo's kitchen. Dante followed the direction of Sophie's finger, and through the window glass still streaked with half-dried lines from a cleaning cloth, he allowed his gaze to finally settle on her, no longer as a background figure he had been observing, but as the woman who held the girl's entire world. Amelia was moving between 2 tables near the counter, a tray balanced in her right hand with 3 plates on it, her left hand keeping her balance by letting her body tilt slightly to one side, her hair tied in a ponytail, though half of it had come loose and clung to her forehead and neck, and she was smiling at an older customer near the window, the kind of smile Dante recognized instantly because he'd seen it thousands of times on the faces of people who worked for him. The smile of someone trying hard to keep everything looking normal while inside nothing was normal at all. Her eyes weren't smiling. Her eyes were tired in a way not everyone could see unless they knew where to look. But Dante knew, because he'd spent his whole life reading people, reading what they hid behind what they showed the world, and this woman was hiding a great deal. She reached out to place a plate on the high table in the back corner, and when her arm stretched forward, the black sleeve of the restaurant shirt slid up a few inches. Only a few, but enough. Dante saw it. The bruise on her wrist, fresh, still dark, a shape that didn't come from an accidental bump, but from fingers. 4 parallel marks on the inside of her wrist, and one opposite them on the outer side, the imprint of someone's hand gripping hard enough to leave its shape on skin. And beneath that newer bruise, when the light inside the restaurant struck at the right angle, he saw another layer, a scar about 2 inches long running along the inside of her forearm, healed long ago but still raised beneath the skin, paler than the flesh around it. The kind of scar that didn't come from a kitchen accident or knocking into the edge of a table. 2 layers of injury. One old, one new, and Dante, who'd seen enough violence in his life to know exactly where every wound came from, understood at once that both of those layers told the same story. His eyes narrowed, only slightly, almost too little to notice unless you were Frank Lombardi, watching through the camera from the SUV a block away, and recognizing that small shift immediately, because after 20 years he knew that wasn't the expression of curiosity or concern. It was the look his boss wore just before someone got into very serious trouble. Amelia set the plate down, pulled her sleeve back into place with the speed of a reflex she'd practiced, who knew how many times, and went on serving the next table, without knowing that in the instant her sleeve had slipped up. She'd let a man who shouldn't have known see the thing she didn't want anyone to see. Then she glanced outside, probably from habit, checking on Sophie, and her eyes stopped. Her daughter was sitting across from a strange man. Amelia's reaction was immediate. The tray in her hand almost tipped. She set it down quickly on the counter, apologized fast to Connie, then headed straight for the door, her steps quicker than her usual pace on the floor, her face drained a shade paler than it had been a few seconds earlier. She pushed through the glass door, stepped onto the patio, saw Sophie sitting there with her legs swinging happily in front of the man in the black suit, and she grabbed Sophie's hand at once, not hard, but firmly, pulling the little girl to her feet and stepping back with her. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice quick, trembling slightly at the edges, her eyes lowered instead of meeting Dante's. "She didn't mean to bother you. I'm really sorry. She knows better, I'm sorry." 3 apologies in 3 sentences. Dante recognized that it wasn't just politeness. It was the reflex of someone used to apologizing to avoid consequences, used to saying sorry before she even knew whether she'd done anything wrong, because saying sorry was always safer. Sophie looked up at her mother, a little confused because she didn't understand what she'd done wrong, but she didn't protest, because at 6 years old she'd already learned that when her mother held her hand this way, it wasn't the moment to ask why. Dante looked at Amelia. He didn't look at the bruise, didn't look at the sleeve she'd pulled back down, didn't look at any of the things she was trying to hide. He looked at her eyes, and she, though she was keeping her face lowered, felt that look and lifted her gaze for a moment, long enough to catch the way he was looking at her, and long enough to realize it wasn't like any look she'd ever received before. Not pity, not judgment, not curiosity, not the look of poor you that she'd grown too used to from neighbors, from police taking reports, from legal aid attorneys. He was simply looking at her, seeing her, that was all. "She's a good kid," Dante said, his voice even, without rise or fall, but each word placed exactly where it belonged, as if he'd weighed them before speaking. "You should be proud." Then he stood. He said nothing more. He didn't offer his name. He didn't explain why he'd been sitting there, or where the pasta had gone. He walked past her, close enough for Amelia to catch the faint trace of expensive cologne for half a second, then stepped out onto the sidewalk and headed east, with the gait of a man who never hurried because no one dared make him wait. Amelia stood there, still holding Sophie's hand, watching after him until he disappeared beyond the corner. Her heart was beating faster than normal, not from fear. She knew the rhythm of fear. She'd lived with it long enough to recognize it. This wasn't that rhythm. This was the rhythm of something else she couldn't name. And because she couldn't name it, it unsettled her more than fear would have. A block away, Dante opened the rear door of the black SUV and got in. Frank didn't turn around. He waited. Dante was silent for a few seconds, then said, his voice unchanged, as ordinary as if he were reading the weather. "The waitress in the restaurant. Find out who she is." Frank nodded once and started the car. He didn't ask why. He never asked why. Amelia locked the back door of the restaurant a little before 10 that night. Connie had left an hour earlier and reminded her to turn off all the kitchen lights. Sophie had been dozing in the cushioned chair in the corner of the dining room since 8, her knees tucked to her chest, her arms wrapped around the faded pale pink backpack as if it were a teddy bear, her mouth slightly open, her breathing soft and steady in that way. Only children know how to sleep, completely surrendered, completely trusting that the world is safe. Amelia lifted her, settled Sophie's head against her shoulder, adjusted the backpack over one arm, then stepped out onto the now empty street. It was 4 blocks from Russo's kitchen to her studio apartment, a walk that took only 7 minutes in daylight, but at night, when you're carrying a 6-year-old child who weighs nearly 40 pounds in your arms, it feels much longer. Every footstep echoed on the vacant sidewalk. The yellow streetlights cast long shadows over the concrete, and Amelia walked quickly without running, because running would have woken Sophie, and she wanted the little girl to sleep, wanted to keep her inside that dream as long as possible before reality forced its way in. She turned into the familiar alley leading to the old 4-story walk-up with no elevator, pushed the front door open with her hip because both arms were busy holding Sophie, and started climbing the stairs to the 3rd floor. She smelled the alcohol before she saw him, cheap bourbon mixed with cigarette smoke and old sweat, the kind of smell her body recognized before her mind did, and every muscle in her body tightened at once in a reflex trained by years of pain. Troy was sitting on the stair between the 2nd and 3rd floors, his back against the wall, his legs stretched across the path, an empty beer can tipped over beside his foot, his eyes red and glazed in the way Amelia knew all too well. Was the most dangerous kind of drunk, not drunk enough to be unable to stand, but drunk enough to lose control while still staying sober enough to do harm. He looked up when he heard her steps, and the smile that spread across his mouth was enough to make Amelia want to turn around and run back down the stairs. But she didn't run, because her apartment was above him and behind her was the dark street, and she had nowhere else to go. "Give me the kid," Troy said, his voice slow and heavy as he pushed himself up from the step, taller than her by almost a head, broad-shouldered, with the body of a man who'd once been strong but had since been eaten hollow from the inside by alcohol and resentment. Amelia tightened her hold on Sophie. "You can't be here, Troy. The court order says you can't come near us." "Court order," he repeated with a sneer, taking one step up, the distance between them now only an arm's length. "I'm her father. Nobody tells a father he can't see his kid." "You're not a father when you're this drunk. Go away. Please." The word please left her mouth before she could stop it, and she hated herself for it. Hated that after 2 years of divorce, after all those nights of promising herself she'd never beg him for anything again, she still said that word by reflex, because her body remembered that sometimes begging was the only thing that made him stop. But tonight it didn't work. Troy lunged forward, one hand grabbing Amelia's wrist, the same wrist with the fading bruise, and squeezed. Amelia clenched her teeth and swallowed the cry of pain because Sophie was on her shoulder, and she'd rather die than let her daughter wake up and see this. With his other hand, Troy shoved her shoulder against the stairwell wall, his face close to hers, his breath thick with alcohol against her skin, and he whispered in that low, the slow voice he knew frightened her more than shouting ever could. "The court can't protect you. The police can't protect you. Nobody can protect you. You understand?" Then Sophie moved on Amelia's shoulder. The little girl's eyes opened, sleepy at first, then confused, then frightened when she saw Troy's face right there in front of her. And she cried, not loudly, but in that silent way children cry when they've already learned that crying loudly only makes things worse. Tears running down her face while her mouth stayed clamped shut, and that soundless crying was what tore through Amelia more than anything Troy could have done to her wrist. Amelia yanked her hand free, the strength of desperation greater than the strength of his drunkenness, then slipped past him and ran up the stairs, fumbling with her keys in her shaking hand, unlocking the door, stumbling inside, slamming it shut, locking deadbolt 1, deadbolt 2, chain lock 3, then dropping her back against the door, breathing hard, while Sophie clung to her neck and cried into her shoulder. Outside, Troy's footsteps stopped in front of the door. He stood there for a few seconds, then punched it once, hard enough for Amelia to feel the shock through her spine. Then he left, his heavy footsteps fading down the stairs. Amelia pulled out her phone and dialed 911, her voice shaking as she spoke to dispatch. Yes, ex-husband. Yes, there was a restraining order. Yes, he'd left. Yes, she and her daughter were safe. Yes, she would wait. The police arrived 40 minutes later. 2 officers took the report and asked if she was injured. She said no, because the bruise on her wrist was hidden beneath her long sleeve. They checked the hallway, confirmed Troy was gone, advised her to contact her attorney to update the protective order, then left. The door closed. The apartment fell silent. Amelia sat down on the kitchen floor with her back against the refrigerator. Sophie sat in her lap, her head resting against her mother's chest. Her tears dried now, but her small body still trembling in faint, uneven waves. Amelia looked down at her wrist and pulled up the sleeve in the dark. The light from the small window was just enough for her to see the new bruise, deep purple, 4 fingers clearly marked into the skin, lying directly over the older bruise that had already turned yellow and green, and beneath both of those layers, the long scar was still there, had always been there, like a reminder that this wasn't the first time, and if nothing changed, it wouldn't be the last. The next morning, in the penthouse on the top floor of a building in Midtown Manhattan, where the rent for that single floor alone each month was more than Amelia earned in an entire year, Dante sat behind a dark walnut desk, an untouched espresso resting on its surface, morning light pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the full Manhattan skyline. And Frank Lombardi walked in without knocking, because in 20 years he'd never needed to knock, set a thin light brown folder on the desk, then stepped back and stood waiting. Dante opened the folder. Inside were 3 sheets of paper, no more, because the lives of people like Amelia Ward didn't leave much of a trail on paper. No property, no business, no complicated tax records, only the basic lines of information Frank's people had needed less than a night to gather. Amelia Ward, 27 years old, born in Queens. Mother died when she was 19, from kidney failure. Father left when she was young. No siblings, no relatives they could reach. Married Troy Ward at 20, gave birth to Sophie a year later. Divorced him 2 years ago on the grounds of domestic violence, with the court granting Amelia full custody, along with a protective order barring Troy from coming within 300 feet of her and Sophie. Troy had violated the order 4 times in 2 years. The first time he was warned. The second time he was given a small fine he never paid. The third time the court scheduled a hearing, but it was postponed because he didn't appear. The fourth time the police took a report, but didn't arrest him because he'd left the scene before they arrived. On paper, the legal system protected Amelia Ward, but in reality, 4 violations and 4 times without any real consequence had told Troy that the paper was only paper. Amelia's income was $2,200 a month from wages and tips as a waitress at Russo's Kitchen. The rent for her 3rd-floor studio in the old Brooklyn building was $1,400. That left $800 for everything else: food, clothes, things Sophie needed, utilities, phone service, bus fare, and whatever unexpected thing life always throws at people who don't have a safety net. Dante read each line, not quickly, not slowly. At the same pace he read every other report Frank brought him, whether it was a report on a multi-million-dollar deal or the file of a person who needed to disappear. When he finished, he closed the folder, rested his hand on the cover, and sat in silence. Frank stood there, accustomed to this silence, knowing it could last 10 seconds or 10 minutes and neither meant he should speak. But this time, after about half a minute, Frank opened his mouth, his tone careful, but direct in the way only a man who'd followed Dante long enough would dare to be. "Not our business, boss." It wasn't advice. It was a reminder. Frank had seen Dante step into outsiders' affairs exactly twice in 20 years, and both times had ended in blood. Not Dante's blood, but blood they had still been the ones to clean up. And Frank knew that when his boss began taking an interest in someone outside the circle of power, things became complicated in ways no one wanted. Dante didn't look at Frank. He looked at the folder on the desk, tapped the cover twice with his finger, then asked in a voice flat as still water, "Who does Troy Ward owe?" 3 words. Frank heard them and understood immediately, with no need for explanation, no need for context, because after 20 years he knew exactly what that question meant. It didn't mean Dante was curious. It didn't mean Dante was gathering information. It meant Dante had made a decision, and that decision began with finding out who held the string around Troy Ward's neck. Because when you want to control a puppet, you don't need to touch the puppet, you only need to buy the string. Frank nodded once. "I'll have the answer before noon." Then he turned and left, closing the door softly behind him, leaving Dante alone in the wide room overlooking Manhattan, the thin folder still on the desk, the espresso still untouched, and beyond the glass, New York City went on moving without knowing that one of the most dangerous men in it had just decided to interfere in the life of a waitress and her 6-year-old daughter, not because he wanted anything from them, but because of a $4.50 plate of pasta and the words of a child that had reminded him his mother had once been that woman. 4 days after that Saturday afternoon, on an ordinary Wednesday evening when Russo's kitchen was winding down and Connie was standing behind the counter, totaling the end-of-day receipts, the glass door opened and the man walked in. This time he wasn't out on the patio. This time he came straight inside. And everything changed at once, not loudly, not dramatically, only in the way the air inside the restaurant seemed to thicken, the kind of change you feel on your skin before your mind can explain why. Connie was the first to notice. She looked up from her ledger, her eyes catching the man as he passed the counter, and her hand stopped in mid-motion, the pen suspended over the page, because in 15 years of owning this place, and nearly 10 years before that living in the Italian neighborhood in southern Brooklyn, she'd seen enough people walk through a doorway to know when someone didn't belong here, not because they weren't worthy of it, but because they belonged to another layer of the world, a layer people like her only ever heard about and never wanted to see with their own eyes. Dante went straight to table 7, the small table by the inner window, pulled out the chair, and sat down with the ease of a man who might as well have made a reservation. He didn't look at the menu because he didn't need to. The young waitress working the evening shift looked toward Amelia with an expression halfway to pleading, because both of them could feel something about this man they couldn't explain, and Amelia, though her heart kicked one beat faster when she recognized him as the man from the patio that Saturday, still nodded and took the table because it was her job, and she didn't have the luxury of refusing to serve someone just because every instinct in her told her to keep her distance. She walked to table 7, notepad in hand, pen ready. "Good evening. What can I get you?" Her voice was calm, professional, held at exactly the right distance, the way a good waitress always keeps it. Dante looked up. His eyes met hers. And the moment lasted one beat longer than ordinary, not long enough for anyone else to notice, but long enough for both of them to know this wasn't the first time they'd looked at each other. "Spaghetti marinara," he said. He didn't open the menu. He didn't ask what the special was. Just marinara. Amelia wrote it down even though there were only 2 words to write, nodded, and turned away. And when she turned away, Dante watched her. Not her figure, not her hair, but her wrist. Her right wrist this time, where a thin silver bracelet rested, something that hadn't been there on Saturday, worn low enough to cover the patch of skin, where he knew beneath it there was a bruise shaped like 4 fingers. And he understood that the bracelet wasn't jewelry, it was camouflage. The pasta was brought out. Dante ate slowly, unhurried, his eyes sometimes drifting to the street beyond the window, sometimes observing the restaurant, but never looking directly at Amelia, even though he knew exactly where she was in the room at all times. Sophie wasn't there tonight, probably tucked into the kitchen with Connie and the cook, and the little girl's absence meant that table 7 held only a conversation between 2 adults, brief and kept at the proper distance. Amelia came back once to ask if he needed anything else. "No. Thank you." 2 sentences. 6 words total since he'd sat down. Amelia nodded, and this time she didn't turn away immediately. She paused for half a second, as if she wanted to say something more, maybe ask who he was, maybe thank him for what he'd said about Sophie that Saturday, maybe ask why he'd come back, but she didn't, because Amelia Ward had learned that not asking was usually safer than asking. So she turned away and went back to work. Dante finished eating, set his fork down parallel to the knife on the plate in the precise way only someone taught formal table manners does, then stood up. He didn't ask for the check. He simply left a few bills beneath the edge of the plate and walked out the door. No goodbye, no glance back. The bell above the door gave one soft ring, then fell silent. Amelia came to clear table 7, lifted the plate, and her hand stopped. Beneath the edge of the dish, where there were usually only a few dollars in tip money, were 5 $100 bills. $500. She stared down at the money, dirty fork and knife on the plate in one hand, and stood motionless in the nearly empty restaurant, while her mind processed 2 utterly opposite thoughts at the same time. Pride told her she should find him, give it back, say she didn't need anyone's pity, that she wasn't the kind of woman who took money from strangers, that she could take care of her daughter herself. Thank you very much. But reality said something else. Reality said this was more than a third of the rent. Reality said October was turning colder, and Sophie was still wearing last winter's coat, the sleeves too short now, and the fabric thin enough that Amelia had to layer 2 shirts underneath it just to keep her warm. Reality said the refrigerator at home was nearly empty, and she'd been calculating how many more days she could stretch a box of pasta and a jar of canned sauce before the next paycheck came. Reality said these $500 could be a new warm coat for Sophie, a refrigerator full of food for 2 weeks. One night when she didn't have to lie awake doing arithmetic in her head until her eyes burned at 2 in the morning, Amelia stood there, dirty plate in one hand, 5 bills in the other, the restaurant silent around her, and the battle between pride and reality lasted less than 10 seconds but felt longer than any shift she'd ever worked. Then she folded the bills carefully, once in half, then in half again, until they made a neat small square, and slipped them into the pocket of her apron. Her hand was shaking, not from shame, because it had been a very long time since anyone had given her anything without wanting something back. Troy Ward owed $15,000. The debt had started during last year's football season, when he'd bet on the Jets to win 3 games in a row at long odds, because long odds meant a big payout, and Troy had always believed he was 1 win away from hitting it big. That was the core problem with men like him. They weren't addicted to gambling because they loved money. They were addicted to the feeling of believing luck was on its way, that everything was about to change, that they only needed 1 more shot. The Jets lost all 3 games. Troy didn't have the money to pay. And Benny Tate, the man who'd lent him the money, wasn't the kind of creditor who made polite reminder calls. Benny ran a small loan shark operation in Flatbush, not big enough to get onto the radar of federal law enforcement, but big enough to send 2 heavy men to collect every Friday, the sort of low-level business that survives at the edge of the underworld, too small for the major organizations to care about, but cruel enough to destroy the lives of small debtors all the same. Benny met Troy at a cheap bar in Red Hook on a Tuesday night, sat across from him in the darkest corner, and got straight to the point in the voice of a man who'd said the same sentence so many times, it sounded like he was reading from a menu. $15 grand, Troy. Interest is running. What exactly are you planning to pay me with? Troy said he needed more time. Benny said time wasn't free. Then Benny leaned forward, lowered his voice, and made the suggestion the way men like him always make suggestions. Not as an order, but in a way that lets the debtor understand there's only one way out. Your ex-wife works at some Italian place over in Brooklyn, right? Figure out how to get money from her. I don't care how. Troy didn't object. He nodded, because by that point Troy Ward had run out of every other option except going back to the woman he'd beaten, threatened, and legally lost the right to come near, and forcing her to pay a debt she didn't even know existed. He started watching Amelia the very next day. He stood across the street and watched her walk to Russo's in the mornings, sat in his old car, and watched her carry Sophie out of the restaurant at night. Memorized the hours, the route, the habits, in the way of a man calculating his next move, not in the way of a father who wanted to see his child. But Troy didn't know that while he was watching Amelia, someone was watching him. At the same time, in a completely different world, Frank Lombardi sat across from Benny Tate in that same bar, but not in the dark corner. Frank sat in the middle of the room, in broad daylight, because when you represent Dante Corsetti, you don't need the dark corner. The dark corner needs you. Frank placed an envelope on the table. Inside it was $15,000 in cash, and he said to Benny in a tone as mild as if he were ordering coffee, "Troy Ward's debt. My boss wants to buy it." Benny looked at the envelope, then at Frank, and the survival instinct of a man who'd lived long enough at the edge of the underworld to know when not to ask why kept him from asking why. He knew who Frank Lombardi was. He knew the name behind Frank, and he knew that when the Corsetti organization wanted to buy a $15,000 debt that amounted to pocket change for them, it had nothing to do with money. It had to do with control, and Benny wasn't crazy enough to stand in the road once that machine started moving. "He's yours," Benny said, sliding the debt papers across the table and taking the envelope without counting it, because counting money in front of a Corsetti man would have been an insult. The transaction took less than 3 minutes. The debt changed hands. Troy Ward no longer owed Benny Tate. He owed Dante Corsetti. He just didn't know it yet. He still thought he was running from Benny. He still thought his plan to force Amelia to come up with money was his only path out. He still thought he was in control of the situation, when in truth, he was nothing more than a pawn on a chessboard he didn't even know he was standing on, a board where every piece had already been set in place by a man whose name, if Troy had known it, would have sent him fleeing out of New York that very night, and never coming back. Dante began coming to Russo's kitchen every Wednesday and Saturday, as regularly as if it were a schedule no one dared ask about. And his frequent presence changed the restaurant in small ways. Only the people inside it would notice. Connie no longer stiffened when he walked in, but she still kept a respectful distance, the kind of politeness people use when they know there are questions better left unasked. The other staff no longer whispered, but they still avoided serving table 7, so it quietly became Amelia's table by default. And Sophie, the little girl, was the only person in the entire restaurant who treated Dante Corsetti as if he were just a regular customer who happened to come in often for pasta, because to her, that was exactly what he was. Every time Dante sat down at table 7, Sophie would appear within minutes, running out from the corner of the restaurant where she sat drawing, her sketch pad tucked under one arm, her box of crayons in hand, climbing into the chair across from him, and immediately showing off her newest creation, without waiting to be invited. She told him about school, about how Miss Patterson had assigned the class a project on animals, and Sophie had wanted to draw Cheese the cat, but her teacher said it had to be a wild animal, so Sophie drew Cheese wearing a lion's crown, and got an A for creativity. She told him about a classmate named Hannah, who had a box of 64 crayons, while Sophie only had 16. But Sophie told Dante that it didn't matter because 16 colors were enough to draw everything, if you knew how to mix them. Dante listened to all of it. He didn't add much to the conversation, only now and then asking a short question. Did Cheese come by today? Or, what color did you use for the sky? And every one of those small questions made Sophie's eyes light up, because at 6 years old, having an adult ask about something you care about is a gift bigger than any toy. Then, one Saturday evening, when Dante had just sat down and hadn't even ordered yet, Sophie came running out with a sheet of paper hidden behind her back, her eyes glittering in that unmistakable way children have when they are carrying a secret they can't wait to share. She placed the sheet on the table, turned it the right way around, then pushed it toward him with both hands. Dante looked down. It was a drawing done in crayon on white paper, the lines of a 6-year-old child, uneven and unsteady, but clear enough to understand. 2 people sat across from each other at a table, one big person in black, one small person in pink, and between them was a red-orange circle that he recognized as a plate of spaghetti marinara, and above them, in the corner of the page, Sophie had drawn a smiling sun, the kind of sun every child everywhere in the world seems to draw the same way, with straight rays all around it and a curved, happy mouth. "That's you," Sophie said, pointing to the grown-up in black. "And that's me. And that's our spaghetti." Dante looked at the drawing. He didn't look at it the way a man looks at a child's picture. He looked at it the way he had looked at that first plate of spaghetti marinara, as if it were something that shouldn't exist in his world, and yet here it was, real, in front of him, and he didn't know what to do with it. He picked up the drawing carefully with both hands, as if the paper might tear if he wasn't gentle enough, then folded it slowly, once down the middle, then once again so it would fit, and slipped it into the inner left pocket of his suit jacket. That pocket, the pocket that for 20 years had held only one thing. Sophie didn't know that. She only saw Uncle Dante place her drawing in the spot closest to his heart, and she smiled, wide enough to show the gap where her front tooth was coming in, then jumped down from the chair and ran back inside to tell her mother that Uncle Dante liked the picture. Outside, in the black SUV parked in its usual place a block away, Frank Lombardi watched through the camera and saw his boss fold the paper and slide it into the inside pocket of his jacket, the left pocket, the pocket Frank knew better than anyone because he was the one who checked the gun in it every morning before Dante put on his suit. Frank said nothing. He made no note of it. He filed no report. But in 20 years at Dante Corsetti's side, through nights he didn't want to remember and days he wished he could forget, Frank had never once seen his boss place anything in that pocket except a weapon. Until today. That night, Russo's kitchen closed at 9. Connie left earlier than usual because of her back pain. She reminded Amelia to lock up and turn out the lights, then stepped onto the street with the slightly tilted gait of a 60-year-old woman who had spent the whole day on her feet, and the restaurant sank into that particular kind of silence only places that have just been full of noise can hold. The kind of silence still echoing with leftover laughter and voices, and the clink of silverware against plates, as if the walls were still holding the sound and slowly releasing it into the dark. Sophie lay curled up on the long cushioned bench in the corner behind the counter, the spot Connie had made for her from the very first days. Amelia started bringing her to work, a thin blanket pulled over her, her head resting on the small pillow from home, her breathing slow and deep. Amelia began cleaning from the last table inward, wiping tabletops, stacking chairs, picking up napkins fallen on the floor, the closing work her hands did automatically while her mind was somewhere else, thinking about this month's electric bill, thinking about the meeting with the legal aid attorney on Monday, thinking about the shoes Sophie was wearing that had already grown too tight and that she still didn't have the money to replace. She reached table 7 and stopped. Dante was still sitting there. The restaurant was closed. The main lights were off. Only the pale yellow glow from the bar lamps remained, just enough to see by. And he was still sitting in that chair, the empty plate in front of him, his eyes fixed through the glass at the dark street outside, motionless, as if he either didn't realize or didn't care that everyone else had gone home and he was the only person left. Amelia stood beside the table, cleaning cloth in her hand, and watched him for a few seconds. Then she did something she hadn't planned, hadn't thought through, hadn't weighed the consequences of. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. She didn't ask. She didn't ask permission. She just sat. The way Sophie had sat down across from him that first Saturday afternoon, naturally, as if the seat belonged to her. Dante shifted his gaze from the window to her. He didn't look surprised, or if he was, he didn't show it. His face remained that same flat water he always kept, but he didn't tell her to leave, and in Dante Corsetti's world, that silence was an invitation. "Why do you keep coming back?" Amelia asked, her voice soft, not accusing, not nosy, just a direct question from a woman too tired to circle around things anymore. Dante was silent, not the silence of refusal, but the silence of a man deciding how much he was willing to say, how wide he was willing to open that door, because every word he spoke was a layer of armor removed, and he hadn't taken off his armor in front of anyone except his mother for his entire life. Then he spoke. "My mother used to work here." His voice was low and slow, each word laid down carefully, like placing bricks. "More than 30 years ago, for the old owner, before Connie bought the place. She washed dishes, waited tables, cooked when they let her. She was an immigrant, from a small village in southern Italy you wouldn't find on a map. No papers, no English, nothing except her hands." He paused, his finger tapping lightly on the table once, a habit Frank would have recognized as a sign his boss was pressing down emotion. "She raised me in this place, waitressing wages and tips, just like you." Amelia didn't move. She didn't nod. She didn't say, "I understand," or "I'm sorry," or any of the things people usually say when someone shares something heavy, because she knew that sometimes those words don't help. Sometimes they are only noise filling a space that ought to stay empty. She just listened. "She died 23 years ago, Dante continued, his voice unchanged in volume, but with something at the edge of it. A faint tremor that would pass unnoticed if you weren't paying attention. Cancer. From the day they found it to the day she was gone was 4 months. Not enough time to prepare. Not enough time to say everything that needed to be said." He looked around the restaurant, his eyes drifting over the brick wall, the bar, the chalkboard menu, as if he were seeing another version of the place, the version from 30 years ago that only he could still see. "She was the only person who looked at me and saw a human being. Not the name, not the thing people whispered about. Just her son. That was all." The last sentence came out softer than the ones before it. So soft it was nearly swallowed by the silence of the empty restaurant. And Amelia heard in it something she hadn't expected to hear from this man. Loneliness. Not the loneliness of someone with no one around him, but the loneliness of someone surrounded by the whole world and still unseen by anyone in it. She understood that kind of loneliness. She lived with it every day. The silence between them stretched on, but it wasn't heavy. It was the rare kind of silence that didn't need filling, because both of them knew what it felt like to sit alone in quiet, and having someone else sit beside that quiet with you was already enough. Then Amelia spoke, her voice low, her eyes turned toward the corner where Sophie was sleeping. "Sophie looks at me that way. Every day she looks at me and sees Mom. Just Mom. Not a tired woman, not a failed mother, not any of the things I see when I look in the mirror. Just Mom. And every day I keep going because of that look." She turned back to Dante, and their eyes met in the dim yellow light of the empty restaurant, and neither of them said anything more. They didn't need to, because in that moment, between two people from completely different worlds, a man the whole city feared and a woman the whole city had forgotten, something shifted, quietly, almost invisibly, like the sound of a door opening that no one heard. The following Friday night, Russo's kitchen was at its busiest of the week. 14 of the 16 tables occupied. Laughter and conversation layered over one another into that warm, familiar noise. Only a family restaurant has at peak hour. Connie behind the counter, directing the floor. 2 waitresses moving between tables. Amelia carrying a tray with 3 plates out from the kitchen. Sophie in her usual corner drawing. And everything was completely ordinary until the glass door was shoved open so hard that the bell hanging above it rang wildly and struck the wall with a sharp, jarring sound that made the entire restaurant turn at once. Troy Ward stood in the doorway, his shoulders nearly filling the frame, jacket wrinkled, eyes red and blurred, the kind of drunk Amelia recognized in less than half a second because she'd seen it too many times, the kind of drunk where he was no longer Troy but the worst version of Troy, the version with no brakes. The smell of bourbon and sweat drifted in from the doorway. His eyes swept across the restaurant, searching, and when they landed on Amelia standing frozen in the aisle with the tray in her hands, he walked straight in, not caring about the 14 tables of customers staring at him, not caring what Connie was saying behind the counter because he wasn't listening. "You owe me," Troy said, loud enough for the whole restaurant to hear, slurred but clear in every word, the language of a man who'd practiced speaking while drunk so often it had become second nature. 15 grand. You figure out how to get it for me or I'll take it myself. Amelia set the tray down on the nearest table, her hands shaking, but her voice steadier than she'd expected. Maybe because customers were all around her. Maybe because Sophie was in the corner and she needed to control the situation before her daughter realized what was happening. "Troy, go outside. You can't be here. You know that. Don't tell me what I know," he said, taking 2 more steps until there was only an arm's length between them, and his voice dropped without becoming any less dangerous, only shifting from shouting into threat. 15 grand. If I don't have it, they'll kill me. Do you understand? I don't have that kind of money, Troy. Then get it. He grabbed the nearest table and flipped it, plates and glasses crashing to the floor in a violent burst, the customers at that table jumping up and screaming, one woman pulling her child backward, and the whole restaurant falling into chaos in less than 2 seconds. Troy lunged at Amelia, one hand grabbing her hair and yanking her head back so hard she had to clamp her teeth together to swallow the cry of pain, his other hand clutching the collar of her shirt as he pressed his face close to hers and growled into her ear in the voice she knew came right before he hit her. "I'm not joking. Get the money, or next time I won't come here. I'll come to your home." And then Sophie appeared. The little girl ran out from the corner before anyone could stop her, small feet striking the wooden floor, her eyes full of tears, and she threw herself straight at her mother, both arms wrapping around Amelia's leg, her face pressed into her hip, crying, not loudly, but with that strangled sound of a child so frightened no full voice could come out. Troy looked down at Sophie as if she were an obstacle, and he shoved her aside with one hand, not a punch, not a slap, just a shove. But the force of a drunk grown man was far heavier than the body of a 40-pound 6-year-old child, and Sophie flew sideways, lost her balance, and fell, the right side of her head striking the leg of an iron chair with a short, hard sound Amelia would hear again in nightmares for many nights after. Sophie lay on the floor, one hand clutching her head, blood running from a small split just above her right temple, red in her blonde hair, red on her tiny hand, red on the wooden floor of Russo's kitchen. And she cried, this time out loud, the heartbreaking cry of a child who was hurt and terrified, and couldn't understand why the world was doing this to her. Amelia screamed, tore herself free of Troy, and dropped to the floor beside Sophie, gathering her up, her hands shaking violently as she saw the blood on her daughter's head. And in that moment she couldn't think of anything except that her child was bleeding, and she couldn't protect her. She hadn't protected her. The customers were panicking, someone calling 911, others pressing themselves back against the wall, Connie shouting in Italian and English behind the counter, and Troy stood in the middle of that chaos, breathing heavily, his eyes moving back and forth. So drunk it took him a few seconds to understand what had happened, and then he looked down at Sophie bleeding on the floor, and maybe, somewhere deep under the liquor and the resentment, he understood that he had just crossed a line he couldn't come back from. Then the restaurant door opened. It wasn't shoved. It wasn't kicked. It opened. Calmly, quietly, and Dante Corsetti stepped inside. He entered the way he did everything. Not fast, not slow, precise, each footfall carrying the weight of complete control. And what came in with him wasn't noise or violence, but silence. A silence that moved outward from him like a wave, touching everyone in the room and making them all stop at once. The customers stopped. Connie stopped. Even Troy stopped, turning around, and for the first time saw the man standing in the doorway. Troy's survival instinct screamed inside him, screamed that he should run, that this man was dangerous in a way Troy could feel even through the alcohol, dangerous in the skin and the bones, the kind of danger you don't need a name to recognize. You only need to look into the eyes and see the total calm of someone who has walked through worse things than anything Troy could imagine. But the liquor held him in place. The liquor told him he wasn't afraid of anyone. The liquor lied. Behind Dante, Frank Lombardi and 2 other men came in through the back entrance, without anyone noticing when they'd arrived, blocking the way out by the kitchen, silent, arms folded, eyes fixed on Troy. Dante didn't look at them. He looked at the restaurant floor. He looked at Sophie in Amelia's arms, blood on the child's temple, tears on her cheeks, one small hand clutching her mother's shirt. Then he looked at Amelia, holding her daughter, trembling, red-eyed, hair fallen loose, the old bruise on her wrist visible because the sleeve had been dragged aside when Troy grabbed her. Then he looked at Troy, and Troy, even drunk, recognized that look as something unlike any look he'd ever received in his life. It wasn't anger, it wasn't threat. It was something worse than both of them put together. It was the calm of a man who had already decided. "She told you to leave," Dante said, his voice low and even, without rise or fall, as calm as if he were reading the weather. "You should leave." Troy opened his mouth, maybe to say something, maybe to curse, but Frank was already behind him, one hand settling on Troy's shoulder, not hard, but with the weight of a hand that made it clear this wasn't a suggestion. Troy was taken out through the back door into the alley behind the restaurant, and the door shut behind him, leaving the restaurant so quiet that Sophie's soft sobbing could be heard. Dante ignored every eye in the room, ignored Connie gripping the cash register with both hands, ignored the customers pressed against the wall too frightened to move, and walked to Amelia and Sophie, then lowered himself to the floor beside them. He didn't speak. He didn't touch them. He just sat down on the dirty restaurant floor, his expensive suit against the wood marked with blood, and stayed there. Sophie, her face wet with tears, her eyes squeezed shut against her mother's chest, one hand gripping Amelia's shirt, stretched out her other hand, the tiny fingers still smeared with blood, searching, and took hold of Dante's finger. She held on tight, and Dante, the man whose hands had signed orders that erased enemies, had shaken governors' hands, had held guns without ever trembling, let that tiny hand curl around his finger, and he held still for her, gently, carefully, as if he were holding the most fragile thing in the world, and knew that if he tightened even a little, it would break. Dante rose from the restaurant floor after Sophie let go of his finger because she had fallen into the sleep of pure exhaustion in Amelia's arms, the kind of sleep a child's body drops into when it can't endure anymore. Her eyes swollen red, the blood at her temple no longer flowing but still dried against her skin, in her hair, on the collar of her shirt. He looked at Amelia once, said nothing, then stepped out through the back door. The alley behind Russo's kitchen was dark and narrow, carrying the smell of trash bins and damp concrete, with a security light on the wall flickering a weak yellow glow. Troy had already been taken away. Frank had made sure of that. But Frank was waiting beside the back door, his back against the brick wall, his 2 men gone with Troy. And when Dante stepped outside, Frank pushed himself off the wall and stood straight, waiting. Dante stopped in the alley, took a long breath of the cold October air, and when he spoke, his voice was perfectly flat, nothing in the sound of it suggesting that 5 minutes earlier he had been sitting on the floor holding the bloody hand of a 6-year-old child, because Dante Corsetti did not carry emotion into orders. That was the rule he lived by, and it had kept him alive this long. "The debt," he said. "Erase it." Frank nodded. That was the easy part. The $15,000 already belonged to them. Making it disappear would take only one call. But Dante wasn't finished. "Make sure he understands," he continued, in the same even voice, the same measured breathing, as if he were talking about the weather instead of deciding a man's fate. "If he shows up anywhere within 10 blocks of her or the little girl, that will be the last time he shows up anywhere." Frank looked at Dante. 20 years, and Frank had heard orders like that before, orders that sounded as polite on the surface as an invitation to dinner, but underneath were a sentence no court would ever need to hand down. And he knew that when Dante said last time, it wasn't a figure of speech. Understood, boss. 2 words. Enough. Dante turned and went back inside the restaurant. Frank remained in the alley for a few seconds more, pulled out his phone, dialed a number, said a few short sentences whose exact content no one would ever know except the 2 men on that call, then slipped the phone away and walked off. Because in that world, everything moved through short phone calls like that, and what happened afterward was the kind of thing no one ever put on paper. Inside Russo's kitchen, almost all the customers had gone. Connie had closed early. She stood behind the counter with a glass of water in one hand, her hand trembling faintly, though her face stayed calm because she was a 60-year-old Italian woman in Brooklyn, and she had lived through enough to know how to keep standing when the floor shook. Amelia was still on the floor, her back against a table leg, Sophie in her lap, the little girl asleep, her face pale, the small cut at her temple covered with a bandage Connie had applied while they waited for an ambulance that Amelia had finally refused, because she had no health insurance, and the wound was small enough to treat herself. A decision only people without money really understand. Why it makes sense, even when it sounds insane. Dante came in through the back, crossed the kitchen, stepped into the main room, and saw Amelia on the floor. He didn't come closer than he needed to. He didn't sit down beside her again. He didn't say, "Are you okay?" because that question was meaningless when the answer was so obviously no. He didn't say, "Everything will be okay," because he wasn't the kind of man who promised things he didn't control. He pulled a chair from the nearest table, set it a few feet from Amelia, and sat down. That was all. Presence. No pressure. No expectation. No demand that she be strong or talk or do anything at all, except sit there holding her daughter and breathe. And Amelia, the woman who hadn't cried in front of Troy because crying gave him power, who hadn't cried in front of the police because crying meant admitting weakness, who hadn't cried in front of Connie because crying meant putting her burden on someone else's shoulders, looked at the man sitting a few feet away in the empty restaurant, silent, not looking at her with pity, not treating her like a victim who needed to be rescued, simply being there, and she cried. She couldn't stop it. She didn't want to stop it. Tears ran down her face and fell into Sophie's hair. She cried silently, her shoulders shaking, her breath breaking, and she didn't turn her face away, didn't apologize, didn't explain, because for the first time she was crying in front of someone without feeling weak, not because she was stronger, but because he wasn't looking at her like someone who needed to be pitied. He was looking at her like someone who was fighting, and that was what Amelia Ward needed more than any comfort words anyone could have offered. 3 weeks after that night, Troy Ward disappeared from New York. Not the loud kind of disappearance people call running away, but the kind where a man is here one day and simply not here the next. The room he rented in Flatbush empty, his belongings left behind, the landlord saying he'd paid off all his back rent in cash and left without saying where he was going, and no one looked for him because no one cared enough to. Amelia knew he was gone because for the first time in 2 years, she walked home at night without sweeping her eyes over the stairwell, without holding her breath when she unlocked the door, without lying awake waiting to hear footsteps in the hallway. She could breathe, truly breathe, the kind of breathing you don't realize you've lost until it comes back, the kind that reaches all the way to the bottom of the lungs, the kind her body had forgotten how to do, because for so long it had kept itself shallow, ready, alert. Sophie slept better. The cut on her temple healed, leaving behind a small scar the doctor at the community clinic said would fade with time. And Amelia prayed that was true. Not only for the scar on the skin, but for the scar she couldn't see. But with the relief came questions. They began quietly, in those still moments after Sophie had fallen asleep, and Amelia sat alone in the studio apartment with a cup of cold tea in her hand. Troy owed money to dangerous people. He'd said so that night, in the restaurant, $15,000. So why had he suddenly vanished without anyone chasing him? What kind of man walks into a restaurant in the middle of chaos and makes the whole room freeze? Who has enough power that 2 men appear through the back door and take Troy away without anyone calling the police, without anyone protesting, without anyone even questioning it? And why had all of it happened at exactly the right moment? One night after her shift, when Sophie was asleep and the restaurant was closed, Amelia sat on her bed with the old laptop she'd bought secondhand from a used goods store, opened Google, and typed 2 words, Dante Corsetti. There weren't many results. No Wikipedia page, no LinkedIn profile, no article with his name in the headline, but there was enough. One article on a local news site from 7 years earlier mentioned the Corsetti family in a money laundering trial, where every defendant had been acquitted. One long analysis on an organized crime investigation blog listed the name Corsetti beside a map of controlled territories in New York. One grainy photo taken from a distance at someone's funeral showed a man in a black suit standing among other men, his face unclear, but the build, the posture, the way the men around him leaned slightly toward him, the way sunflowers lean toward the sun. Amelia recognized him immediately. She closed the laptop, sat there in the dark. Her heart was beating fast, but not because she was afraid of Troy, because she was afraid of the truth. The next day she asked Connie, gently, pretending to sound casual. "Connie, do you know who he is? The customer at table 7? Connie was folding napkins. Her hand stopped for one beat, then continued folding without looking up. "Some things are better left unknown, Amelia." That answer confirmed everything Google had only suggested, but Amelia wasn't the kind of woman who could accept not knowing. She had spent too many years living in the shadow of not knowing where Troy was, not knowing when he would appear, not knowing whether tonight would be safe, and after the divorce she'd promised herself she would never again let her life be ruled by not knowing, no matter how frightening the truth might be, because knowing was still better than not knowing. Saturday night, the restaurant closed. Sophie slept in the corner. Dante sat at table 7, and Amelia didn't clear the table, didn't pull out the chair and sit down the way she had before. She stood beside the table, the cleaning cloth still in her hand, though she wasn't cleaning anything, and looked straight into his eyes. "I know who you are." 3 words. Amelia said them in an even voice, without trembling, without lifting the pitch, because she had rehearsed the sentence in her head for 3 days, and she knew that if she let her voice shake, she would lose control of this conversation, and she couldn't lose control. Not this time. Dante looked at her. His face didn't change. No surprise. No defensiveness. No anger. No sorrow. He only looked at her with those calm eyes she'd seen many times before, but this time, they felt different. Because this time she knew whose eyes they really were. "You're a dangerous man." Dante didn't deny it. "Yes. You've done terrible things. Yes." No explanation, no justification, no but. No, you don't understand. None of the things people say to soften what they are. Only the truth. Clean, precise, 2 yeses, and each one carried the weight of a whole life Amelia had only glimpsed the edges of. Amelia swallowed, tightened her grip on the cloth in her hand, and asked the question she truly needed answered. "Then why did you help me?" Silence. Dante didn't answer right away. He looked at her, then down at the table, his finger tapping lightly once, and the silence stretched between them, heavy, full. Not the empty kind of silence, but the silence of a man deciding whether he had the courage to tell the truth. Because there are truths that once spoken can never be taken back. And Dante Corsetti, who had never been afraid of anyone in his life, was afraid of his own answer. The silence between them stretched long enough for Amelia to hear the wall clock behind the register counting off each second, the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the steady sound of Sophie breathing in the corner of the restaurant, the kinds of sounds you never hear when the place is full. But in this silence they grew so loud they nearly filled the room. Then Dante spoke. "Because my mother was you." He said it in English, not because he wanted distance, but because this was the language his mother had chosen when she decided America would be home, the language she had learned 1 word at a time in the kitchen of this restaurant between dishwashing shifts, the language she had used to tell her son that he would have a better life than she had. She was alone. 1 child. No one helping. No family here. No money. No legal papers. Nothing. She did everything by herself because she had no other choice. He stopped. His finger tapped the table once, then curled into a fist, but she shouldn't have had to be alone. No one should. And on the word "one," his voice broke. Not loudly, not in the way voices break in films, not a clear tremble or a choke of tears, only a tiny fracture at the edge of the final word, so small that if Amelia hadn't been standing this close, she wouldn't have heard it, but she was close enough, and she did hear it, and she knew exactly what it was, because she had heard that same fracture in her own voice more times than she wanted to admit, the sound of someone who had held on too long and was beginning to lose the strength to keep holding. Amelia looked at him, really looked at him, not at Dante Corsetti, the head of a crime family, not at the dangerous man she had just confronted, but at the son sitting in the restaurant where his mother had once washed dishes, and missing her so much that his voice broke at the edge of a word he had thought he could control. And she understood, not with logic or information, but with the instinct of someone carrying the same kind of wound, even if that wound had come from entirely different circumstances, understanding that this man, whatever he was to the rest of the world, was sitting in front of her with the door inside him cracked open, and if she said one wrong word, that door would close and never open again. She didn't say the wrong thing. She told the truth. Sophie asked me why Mr. Dante always looks sad. Dante looked up, slightly surprised, not by the sentence itself, but because his name in the mouth of a 6-year-old child alongside the word sad was a combination no one in his empire would dare imagine, much less say aloud. I didn't know how to answer her then, Amelia continued, her voice soft, but every word chosen carefully. Not because she was afraid, but because she knew this moment mattered, and she didn't want to waste it. But now I think I understand. She stepped one pace closer to table 7, the cleaning cloth still in her hand, though she had forgotten it was there long ago. You think that because you've done terrible things, you don't deserve anything good. You think the world owes you punishment, so you punish yourself, once a year, sitting here alone remembering your mother, and not allowing yourself to eat a plate of pasta, because you believe even that is more than you deserve. Dante said nothing. His jaw tightened. His eyes stayed on her, but there was something moving behind them now, something rising toward the surface while he tried to force it back down with all the strength 20 years at the top of an empire had given him. But you're wrong, Amelia said. Because a man who doesn't deserve goodness wouldn't sit outside this restaurant for 3 hours every year just to remember his mother. A man who doesn't deserve goodness wouldn't listen to a 6-year-old talk about a stray cat without interrupting her once. A man who doesn't deserve goodness wouldn't keep a messy crayon drawing in his suit pocket, in the very place the whole world knows he keeps something else. That last sentence hit exactly where it needed to. Amelia saw it in his face, saw the precise moment her words moved through every layer of defense and touched the place where he had no armor, and she said the sentence she hadn't planned in advance. It came out because it was true, and the truth sometimes doesn't need rehearsal. Just because you've done terrible things doesn't mean there's nothing good left in you. And Dante Corsetti broke. Not loudly, not dramatically, not in the way people break in films, collapsing over tables or sobbing or shouting. He broke the way people who have held on too long break, silently, slowly, one piece at a time. Like concrete splitting, not because it was struck hard, but because roots underneath had been pushing upward for too long, and at last the concrete could no longer bear it. His eyes went red. His jaw clenched so hard the muscles stood out sharp along both sides of his face. He turned his face away and looked out through the glass to the dark street beyond, and Amelia saw his shoulders shake. Only once, quick, and then he mastered it again. But she had seen it, and she knew what it was. She didn't step closer. She didn't touch him. She didn't say anything else. She simply stood there, 2 steps away, giving him that moment without taking it from him, without judging it, without letting anyone witness it but her, because she understood that sometimes what a person needs isn't comfort, but permission. Permission not to be strong for 30 seconds. Then a small sound came from the corner of the restaurant. Both of them turned. Sophie was standing beside the cushioned bench, her curly hair tousled into a wild halo from sleep, her eyes still heavy, one hand rubbing them, the other clutching the old teddy bear missing one eye that she had carried since she was 2. And she looked at Dante with sleepy innocence, knowing nothing of what had just passed between the 2 adults, knowing nothing of crime empires or truth or the crack in a man's voice. She only saw that Mr. Dante was still here and that it was late, and she said in a little voice rough with sleep, "Mr. Dante, can you stay? Mama can make you spaghetti." The restaurant fell quiet again. The clock ticked. The refrigerator hummed. Dante looked at Sophie, the 6-year-old child hugging her bear and standing in the middle of the empty restaurant asking him to stay. The simplest question in the world from the simplest soul in his life, and then he looked at Amelia, the woman standing 2 steps away with a cleaning cloth in her hand, and eyes that had just watched him break without turning away. Dante Corsetti, who had never once run out of words in any negotiation, who had never failed to have an answer for any situation, who had never in his life been put in a position where he didn't know the next move. For the first time in his life, didn't know what to say. 6 months later, Russo's kitchen was still there, on the same street corner, with the same faded red and white striped awning, the same glass door with the open sign hanging slightly crooked, but some things had changed. The kitchen had been renovated, not torn apart and rebuilt from scratch, but repaired in exactly the places that needed repair. The pipes no longer leaked. A new oven replaced the old one that used to shut off in the middle of service. The kitchen walls had been repainted a clean white, and Connie, for the first time in 15 years of ownership, no longer had to lie awake doing the math over whether this month she could afford to fix the plumbing or whether it would have to wait until the next. The money had come from an investment that, on paper, belonged to a small real estate company registered in Manhattan. The kind of company where, if you searched for it, everything looked legal, every document looked clean, and you would never find the name Dante Corsetti anywhere in the records. The only condition attached to that investment, spoken aloud between Dante and Connie in a brief conversation no one else heard, was that Amelia Ward be promoted to restaurant manager. Connie agreed, not because she was forced, but because she had known for a long time that Amelia deserved that position. She simply had never had the money to pay a manager's salary until now. Amelia protested. Of course she protested. She stood in the restaurant kitchen after closing, her back against the spice cabinet, her arms crossed over her chest, and told Connie she wouldn't accept a position she hadn't earned through her own ability, that she didn't want to owe anyone, that she was already tired enough of depending on other people. Connie listened, dried her hands on her apron, then answered in the voice of a mother speaking to her daughter, not an owner speaking to an employee. You've worked here 4 years, never missed a day, carried trays with bruises on your hands, smiled at customers when you wanted to cry. You don't owe anyone. You're accepting something you've deserved for a long time. It's only now that someone smart enough has finally noticed. Amelia didn't say anything else. She looked through the kitchen door into the front room, where Sophie was sitting in her usual place drawing, and she thought about the new shoes she would be able to buy for her daughter, about a refrigerator full of food, about sleep that didn't require counting every dollar until 2 a.m, and she nodded, not because of Dante, because of Sophie. Troy Ward was arrested in Newark, New Jersey, 2 months after disappearing from New York, for drug possession and for violating the terms of release from an earlier case after he had skipped his court date. He was held without bail. Amelia read the news on her phone while sitting in the small room behind the restaurant that was now her office as manager, and she didn't feel joy, didn't feel relief. She only felt something quietly closing, like shutting a book she had been reading for too long. Then October came, Rosa's death anniversary. Dante arrived at Russo's kitchen at 3 p.m, black suit, alone. But instead of sitting outside on the patio like he used to, he walked straight inside to table 7. But this year was different. This year, he didn't need a child's tin box coins to break his fast. He sat down and ordered the spaghetti marinara himself, choosing to celebrate his mother's memory rather than punish himself. Amelia took the order from the kitchen station, entered it into the system, and paused for 1 second looking at the words on the screen. Table 7, spaghetti marinara. 1. Then she smiled softly, the kind of smile whose meaning only she understood. Sophie had just gotten out of school and came running into the restaurant the way she always did, backpack on her shoulders. But today, instead of sitting in the corner to draw, she spotted someone familiar at table 7, and her eyes lit up. She didn't run to the table right away. She opened her backpack, pulled out a sheet of drawing paper that had been carefully rolled and tied with a rubber band, and only then did she run to table 7, climb into the chair across from Dante, and place the paper on the table. I made this for you. Dante looked at the little girl, then at the paper. He slipped off the rubber band, opened it, and spread it flat on the tabletop. It was a crayon drawing, this time better than the first one, because in the last 6 months Sophie had turned 7, and her lines had grown steadier, clearer, more confident. 3 people sat around a table, a grown-up in black on the left, a grown-up in blue on the right, and a small figure in pink sitting between them. In the middle of the table was the familiar red-orange circle of a plate. Above them was the smiling sun that appeared in all of Sophie's drawings, but this time it was larger, with more rays stretching outward. And beneath the table, Sophie had written one word in uneven capital letters, slanting across the page, with the dot over the I placed a little too high, but the word was still easy to read. Family. Dante looked at the drawing. He didn't glance at it the way adults usually glance at children's art, praise it, then look away. He looked for a long time. He looked at the figure in black that he knew was himself. He looked at the figure in blue that he knew was Amelia. He looked at the little pink figure in the middle. He looked at the word family written in red crayon, and his hand trembled. Not from cold, not from fear, not from anger, but from something else. Because for the first time in his 36 years of living, Dante Corsetti felt what his mother had told him in this kitchen more than 30 years ago, that food made with love always tastes different. And now he understood. Now he truly understood, not with his mind, but with his chest, with his throat tightening, with his eyes burning, that his mother had never been talking only about food. She had been talking about love, that anything given with real love, whether it was a $4 plate of pasta, or a crayon drawing, or the act of sitting down beside someone when the whole world has walked away, carried a different taste, touched differently, remained differently. Amelia came out from the kitchen door, untied her apron, folded it over one arm, walked to table 7, and without saying a word, pulled out a chair and sat down beside Sophie. 3 people at table 7. The October afternoon sunlight came through the glass in a warm golden wash, falling across the table, across the plate of spaghetti marinara, across the crayon drawing, across 3 people, from 3 completely different worlds, who had somehow found one another in a little restaurant in Brooklyn, where more than 30 years earlier, an immigrant woman had washed dishes and cooked pasta, and dreamed that her son would have a better life, and maybe, in a way she had never imagined, that dream was coming true. Not through money or power, but through a plate of pasta, a drawing, and the word family written in red crayon. Dante Corsetti had built an empire out of fear, blood, and silence. He had moved through this world like a shadow no one dared touch, but a 6-year-old girl with $4.50 and a plate of spaghetti had done what no one else could. She sat down, and he stayed. If this story touched your heart, please press the like button so it can reach more people. Share it with a friend, a loved one, someone you think may need to hear this today. And if you haven't subscribed to our channel yet, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next stories we bring you every day. Today's story reminds us that sometimes what changes a person's life isn't something huge, not money or power or miracles, but only one small act done with a whole heart, a plate of pasta bought with the last few coins, one sincere question from a child too innocent to be afraid, or simply the act of sitting down beside someone and staying when everyone else has walked away. In real life, we aren't mafia bosses or waitresses like the people in this story, but every day we all meet people who are sitting alone outside, people who need someone to stop for a moment, and maybe the only thing they need is to know they are still worthy. We'd truly love to hear how you felt after this story. Which part touched you most? Which line made you stop? And if you've ever met someone like Sophie or someone like Dante in your own life, please share it in the comments below. We read every comment, and every story you share becomes part of the inspiration that helps us keep bringing more meaningful videos each day. We wish all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, peace, and days filled with quiet happiness beside the people you love. Thank you for staying with us until the final minute. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video.